A very warm welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Amal Lateef. Dr. Amal Lateef teaches at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at SRM University. And Dr. Lateef has done doctoral work on gender and transnationalism, on which she's going to be speaking about today. And other than this, she's been actively engaged in a collaborative postdoctoral research within the project titled Engage Scholarship Against Climate Change, Water, Vrije University, Amsterdam. And Amal's interests are in the areas of gender and migration, minorities and marginalization, narrative studies, and the blue economy. And a very warm welcome to you, Amal. We are very fortunate that you're here with us and you will share your work on gender and transnationalism. Over to you.
Yeah, so my work largely looked at the women domestic workers migration, particularly from India to the Gulf. So doing a course like migration, mobility and development, I think it also becomes very important for researchers to kind of understand what it means to research migration as well. Because researching migration, particularly looking at gender dynamics of migration, can be an extremely, it's very dynamic, I feel. It doesn't, throughout the process, it keeps changing and, it is through this particular process that sometimes we figure the methods and how the methodology kind of, moves. So that was one, important part which I kind of learned in doing research on migration. So if I'm looking at, particularly why Gulf migration, as I worked on women domestic workers moving from India to the Gulf, one question that, that came up to my mind, particularly on Gulf migration was, how migration from Kerala to the Gulf has always been the journey of men. And there is an overwhelming focus when it comes to, the male migration. But then it also belies the assumption that the women's movement is negligible. So Praveena Kodoth is one researcher who has done immense amount of work on gender and migration when it comes to the Gulf migration. She notes that there is a tendency to naturalize the male breadwinner norm in the social science literature on Kerala's international migration in the Kabasi, for example. It is in term, that particular word describes an expatriate, but a male expatriate particularly. So it has been naturalized to mention that it is the male breadwinners that's been mentioned here. So that exactly makes it very important for me to look at the domestic workers migration, which has been a very age-old migration, but not very much looked at when it comes to the social science literature around Kerala's international migration to the Gulf. So the field site particularly included the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, as well as India, particularly Kerala. So why both these field sites is because it gives the movement of the women domestic workers from one to the other, basically looking at migration through as a cycle. And in this transnational ethnography, the data was initially collected through telephonic interviews, as there was a very strict lockdown while the work was carried out. But later on in August 2020, the UAE raised a lot of restrictions as well on mobility, where flights and public transportation was possible. So that kind of allowed me to continue my work. So I took multiple COVID-19 tests as per the state restrictions. All of these were, carefully taken care of as a part of the ethics of the work. And more than 30 migrant women domestic workers from the Gulf and Kerala were part of the study. And participants also included the middlemen, the bureaucrats, who also were an important part of this migration process. And the ethnographic research during COVID-19 raises many ethical and practical dilemmas as well, because carrying out work with a participant community which is extremely vulnerable at the same time raises a lot of questions. Because as I was trying to work with the participants, I was also able to see how there was no evidence for the research, but also there were more pleas for medications and at the same time food kits, for example. And there was also a need to figure a way out to survive the lockdown as well. So as Nancy Schipper-Hughes kind of argues when it comes to ethnographies, she calls for a barefoot ethnography and a womanly hearted ethnography, which calls for a responsible, humanly reflects with political participation. So for me in that process, the challenge was to look at these narratives beyond the paradigm of anthropological data and to view the responsibilities that come up when you meet your participant. And the methods. Now I'll just come to the methods of the work. And maybe before that, the objectives will make it much more, easier to understand. So I'll just highlight what were the objectives of the work as well. And I highlighted the precarious trajectories that migrant Malayali women domestic workers navigate to enter and leave the domestic labor market in the UAE, particularly focusing on the laws pertaining to employment and termination, and also the question of uncertainty and violence around, pertaining to recruitment and termination. So when I'm talking about the uncertainty when it comes to recruitment, it becomes very important for me to look at how body works in these spaces, because when gender comes to the play, there is also the violence around body that comes into play when it comes to the recruitment agencies. So, and then I look at the question of home and belonging. So the methods I have used in my work is interactional analysis, which is chosen as a model of narrative analysis, where the emphasis is given to the dialogic process between the teller as well as the listener. And of course, a feminist methodology is employed to study the research questions. And the major part of my method also involved figuring out research, what it means to research a vulnerable population. So in a space like that, it became very important for me to kind of figure my methodology through embodied methodology, where the theory and methodological practice come hand in hand. It merges the specific theories of feminist, sociological, and queer thinking into practice, enabling a philosophical approach to gender-based interpersonal violence research. And this work also prioritizes the researcher and the others' embodied knowledge and how the social bodies and social identities are associated. Examining power and imbalances from a feminist point of view requires the researcher to understand what it means to be embodied. And now, reading the vocabulary of actions, for example, what it means to act in a certain way, and, the way in which the gestures work throughout the observations within the ethnography across identities who experience structural injustices, for example, is also a significant source of realities that are otherwise considered invisible and unintelligible through an objective lens. Now, as a part of the methodology, I have also looked at what it means to do research in spaces which are extremely uncertain and also involving risk, for instance. So visible markers of the ethnographer, this could be of any form. It could be of gender, religion, caste, class, race, disability. They're all inextricably tied to the ethnographer's position in the field. So positioning oneself in the field becomes a very important act in an ethnography. So getting into crammed apartments, for example, where female domestic workers were locked by one of the recruitment agents I worked with, it was a moment of crucial dilemma. So I, as a woman, taking that sort of extremely risky position, and it was an extremely confusing point of time as well. So I'll just read a bit from my thesis, so you can just understand how risk kind of works when it comes to the uncertainty involved in the field. So he warned me that I should not talk to women in the apartment. I agreed and followed him up a rickety staircase right above his office. He pulled out a cluster of keys from his brownish yellow jacket and opened the door of the first apartment we walked by on the second floor. As we squeezed ourselves through the narrow entrance to the apartment, Ishtar led the way for me. As we entered the apartment, and he locked the door from inside. I looked at him bewildered. He nodded and walked me to meet his partner, who was waiting for us, sitting next to the women domestic workers. The apartment was crammed with shoes spread across the hall, with almost 20 to 25 women sitting beside the half-broken shoe rack. They hardly got a piece of wall behind them to lean on, and few held their backs tight as they sat on the floor. With worn-out eyes, they turned their heads as we moved across the apartment. I noticed a woman leaning on a tiny white door next to the hall. This is the washroom, said Ishtar as he caught me staring at the door, wondering. So this was a moment from my field work where where I was in touch with this particular middleman who recruits women domestic workers from India to the Gulf, particularly from Tamil Nadu, from southern regions of India. So this was a moment where one can clearly see there is risk when it comes to entering certain spaces. So ethnographies can be inherently risky is what I'm trying to tell. So to some extent, as qualitative methods have distinct relationship with risk, and unfamiliar social settings and interactions can make ethnographies unpredictable throughout the journey. But also at the same time, this idea does not necessarily need to push the concept of the researcher as some sort of hero who returns from the unknown, who's going to come and back and narrate a story. But here, as ethnographers, our work is to extend the conception of work to include a broader range of considerations, which might also include less obvious or sometimes even less glamorous risks. So as Max Utters puts it, agency is no longer something you possess or do not when it comes to research. Instead, you maintain it in relation to the social field inhabited by other social actors. The agency is thus highly dependent on specific social situations and is constructed throughout the encounters in the field. Now I'll just quickly come to the theoretical grids of my work. Along with that, maybe I can just move along. Along with that, I can move with my chapters as well. So because if I explain the chapters with the theoretical grids, it will clarify a lot of ideas on how one can actually put the theories and the narrative analysis together. So the first major theoretical grid on which my work largely works on is the invisibility of personhood and the migration regime. So the invisibility of personhood, Raka Ray's idea of the domestic worker, is not only within the private space of work. It extends how the state denies institutional benefits and rights to the migrant female workforce as well. And it expands on the simultaneous idea of invisibilization, where the policies themselves sometimes invisibilize the very existence of the women domestic workers when it comes to the domestic workers moving from India to the Gulf. And I also look at not just the invisibilization, but also the hypervisibilization which happens throughout this process, where this particular community, are also subjected to rampant security and marketization, and which also require very serious attention. So one example to understand hyper-invisibilization would be with the 9/11, for example. There has been enormous emphasis on the typical gender norms in relation to the Muslim minorities in the Western world, for example. So Shireen Razak, who has worked on this, she talks about how men from the community were represented as dangerous and women from the same community were represented as imperiled, for example. So this is how the migration regimes also kind of move between the idea of invisibilization and at the same time hypervisibilization at the same time. And when I'm talking about the hypervisibilization and the invisibilization, it also becomes important for me to look at the other policies such as the kafala system, for example. So under the kafala sponsorship system, the women domestic workers are bound to a relationship of servitude with their sponsor, who is also a kafil in Arabic. So whose permission they must require when they are moving from one employer to the other, for example, or even leaving or visiting home, for instance. So the kafala system basically ties the employee with the employer. So and then there is the under 30 rule, for example. So under the under 30 rule, which is exercised in India, it bans women under 30 and unmarried to move as domestic workers from India to the Gulf, for example. So this came up as a way to protect the women from any sort of violence that can happen in the private spaces of domestic work in the Gulf. But then they clearly, consider women as victims which are incapable of agentic power also at the same time, it has this sort of paternalistic, character kind of tied to it at the same time. So despite being the state with highest literacy rate, for instance, many Kerala women migrate to the Gulf through informal visas. And most of these women are products of poverty, domestic violence, and dowry-related violence back home. So in this case as well, the Indian state fails to recognize the root problems. Rather, it sets out to write down codes and laws that can possibly control their movement in the disguise of safety. So exploring these contradictory paternalistic policies such as kafala and the 30-year-old ban is kind of helped me understand how they systematically channel the movement how there is a lack of systematic channeling of the women domestic workers from India to the Gulf. And crimmigration is another example of this hyper visibilization, if you can see. So there is a thick line between immigration law and criminal law, which has been blurred in the recent understanding of nation state. So today it often becomes hard to explain where the immigration policies end and the criminal law begins. So migrant women domestic workers who are tagged as absconded. So most of the women who would leave the employer's home, or women who would, choose to move away from the sort of violence that happens in the domestic spaces, or women who would just want to leave back home without the permission of the sponsors, they can be tagged as absconded by law. So they are also tagged as thief and immoral, and they are put behind bars without any judicial support, neither from the UAE government or from the government of India. So Juliet Stump, she coins the term crimmigration here in the context of United States to explain how criminal laws and immigration has grown indistinct, so such that the two are merely nominally separate. So the legal systems are contradictory, but also this is how it kind of invisibilizes the very women's personhood. And at the same time, like I said, they are visible, but only when they commit a crime. Now the second thematic grid, as a part of my thematic grid, the other idea that I have worked on is on subjectification. So when it comes to subjectification, the very idea of creating it is a process of basically reinforcing specific disciplinary and regulatory characteristics within a migrant, so that they fit into the niche of being the ideal migrant. And subjectivation is how a citizen practically transforms into a migrant. So when it comes to the case of India and the Philippines, the idea of ideal migrant is constituted against the problematic migrant subject. So even the women domestic workers, if you see, there is this whole idea of unruly femininity, which can be regarded as, lousy migrant, for example, or, unruly sexual conduct, for example, by women is taken as a factor that can undermine the honor and the moral fabric of the very state that they belong to, or the state they are migrating to. So this way, the very idea of subjectification kind of, was very much there when it comes to the Gadamas as well. So it can also be in the form of categorization, for example, of migrant bodies based on different characteristics, which could be in terms of ethnicity, for example, or nationality or race, be paid as much as the Philippine domestic workers, for instance. So on the basis of ethnicity as well, the very subjectification basis. And when I'm talking about the recruitment spaces and the subjectification, it also becomes very important to look at how the very idea of disposition works. When there is subjectification, there is definitely disposition, which kind of works in these recruitment processes. So, when I'm talking about disposition, it is also about, how the Gadamas also negotiate their emotions concerning the violence and the disposition they experience in their everyday lives, both physically and emotionally. So the women are mostly trained by recruitment agencies to perform the ethnicity, for example. So when it's a Malayali or a Tamilian employer which comes by, or any state. So the women domestic workers who belong to certain ethnicity, they are asked to perform their ethnicity at the same time on what they cook, the way the kind of clothes they wear, for example. So, and one example that I can point out to is the Pisharit's study on the influence of Dalit brokers in the channeling of Dalit Dalit laborers to the cities for the construction sector, for example. So the Dalit brokers are just a part of the vertical hierarchy of the broker system, and with more powerful upper caste men as leaders in the recruitment sector, for example, where the Dalitness and the labor, it reproduce one another, and that is exactly what is sold in these markets. So similar to how recruitment agencies for domestic employment in the Gulf become sites for constructing domesticity and, womanhood, for example. So one such instance was one of the agents, who used to take women from Kerala to the Gulf, for example. So she used to tell me how women from the Idukki region of Kerala was better domestic workers than the domestic workers coming from the Palakkad region, for example. So, the exact sentence was that these housemaids is what she told about the women coming from Palakkad. But on the other hand, Idukki women, they are better in the business. So we mostly bring from there. We would choose that, over any other regions, for example. So the subjectification in the recruitment regime also disperses the women of their very self-respect and disperses their emotions on many levels at the same time, because they are constantly asked to perform in a certain way. And and the recruitment process also involves assessing, diagnosing, handling, and manipulating bodies that become the object of the workers' labor. And when it comes to the disposition, I'm also talking about disposition in terms of humiliation that happens with the same, ethnicized bodies. So there is the telescopic violence, for example. When it comes to the domestic workers, for example, cleaning the underarms, using deodorants are also connected to representations of beauty in these recruitment markets. So there was a moment in my fieldwork where one of the agents that was also a participant of my work, he raised his hands and pointed his fingers towards the underarms when the domestic worker was leaving with the employer. The domestic worker basically he brought from India. So when I asked him why exactly did he point out his underarms, as the gesture was something that I kind of noticed, and he told me it's because we insist them on cleaning and keeping their underarms very clean and and also smell good at the same time, so that the employers do not complain about it later on, coming back to the recruitment agents. So one could see how body is kind of how these small gestures are also matched for the unspeakable horror of these recruitment regimes, for example. And I would call it a regime for a reason. And so this is one picture. Yeah, this is one picture from the, from one of the recruitment agencies, and you can see how women are sitting here. Women have been sitting here for a very long time, morning until midnight. They sit here until the right employer comes up and picks them. And you can see in the right side as well, women sitting here. And then you can see we supply your laborers from all over the world, including Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Africa, Ethiopia, Nepal, and India. So this was particularly a region in one of the states called Ajman in the Gulf, where you can see this is basically the larger recruitment regime within the different states of UAE. And now coming to the idea of uprooting and regrounding, which I think kind of very much explains a lot on how the concept of migration and understanding migration studies itself kind of can be pretty much summed up with the idea of uprooting and regrounding by Sara Ahmed. So she provides a very framework for thinking home and migration in ways that open up discussion beyond the oppositions, such as the stasis versus the transformation. So rather than thinking of home and migration as constituted through processes that neatly map into, migrating, and then there is the idea of homing. So Sara Ahmed talks about uprooting and regrounding as an idea which makes it possible to consider home and migration in terms of a plurality of experiences, histories and constituencies, and of the workings of the institutional structures at the same time. So being grounded does not necessarily mean about, being fixed. Being mobile or, migrating itself is not necessarily about being detached either. So that's exactly what this work is trying to do here. It intends to comprehend how uprooting and regrounding amongst the Gaddamas are enacted through plurality of their experiences within the peripheries. And why peripheries? Because it looks at the recruitment labor market, for instance, and their interactional spaces, so not just the private space in which they are working, but something much larger than that. And so under this idea of uprooting and regrounding, I have tried to look at how the women also perceive the idea of home, belonging, and identity as well. So the experiences of Gaddamas, featured in this particular part of the work demonstrate the experiences of Malayali women domestic workers and their sense of belonging and identity in their host country. So when I'm talking about uprooting and regrounding, I'm also trying to ask who are these women at the same time and what entails home for these women. So like I said, as a transnational ethnography, it was important for me to look at what it means to come back as well, and what it means to leave home as well, and what are they exactly living in this process, what entails home for them. So that's where it becomes important for one to understand, reading to understand the structural inequalities back home as well. So I discovered how the uneven development in certain geographical parts of Kerala, for example, played a significant role in the migration of women as Gaddamas to the Gulf. And this particularly includes, for example, one called the Bangladesh colony, for example, in the Trivandrum district of Kerala, for example. So this is also one of the regions which has extremely poor population of Muslims here, and who have been displaced as a part of the airport construction, Trivandrum airport construction, and other development project in these regions. So if you, as I visited the Norca, Norca office in the Trivandrum as well, this was something that kind of, that kind of came up from the participants there. And so, and then coming from space of lack of belonging back home, living in the Gulf and working inside a stranger's home, and there was also there was a need to forge belonging, because one lacked it back home was something that was clearly there in their movement. And even though the unified Kerala was formed 6 decades ago, the Adivasis, Dalit Christians, the Latin Christians, and then the estate laborers or fisherwomen, sexual minorities, they have been structurally turfed out from the political and the social spheres as well. So that's where I was trying to understand what exactly the home entails. And there was also ways in which these women kind of, made up to these sort of lack of belongingness that they felt back home. So one way was through religion, for example. The Gaddamas forged their connection and sense of belonging through their religious identity at times, helping women to transgress the everyday life struggles. And in the case of Indian domestic workers who migrate to the Gulf, the caste discrimination also back home has been another reason behind their choice to move away from home. So Usha from Kannu, she talked to me about how belonging to the mother in the house addressed me in that name. And that made me feel like I belonged there. I could not believe I deserved to feel that way. So there she was clearly talking about, how she also shared on how her mother could not wear footwear back in Kerala for a very long time because she belonged to the marginalized community, and how things changed post the migration as well. So see the slides. So yeah, so this is one of the surveys that was carried out, and women immigrants were concentrated in 4 southern districts: Idukki 35%, Kottayam 33.5%, Ernakulam, Pathanamthitta, and Palakkad in north. And Praveena Koduth, in her work as well, she argues that most of the women migrants in her field work were victims of caste-based and religious discrimination or belong to depressed communities as well. And Yeah, and yes, so there were ways in which women forged their belongingness through political identity at times. So the Gadamas also reorient their actions and diasporic commitments as a path to kind of find belongingness in the Gulf, where many women were also involved with Sharjah, the Malayali associations or the Indian associations within the different states of UAE, for example. So as UL Davis talks, about the diasporic commitment of the migrants, he provides a very helpful reminder that discussing diasporic politics of belonging, it should not make us forget that same people have also developed various forms of belonging, practical, emotional, and sometimes ideological, to the countries where they live. And thus, it should always be considered within a very multi-layered context. And another way in which women kind of try to further understand the idea of belonging in these spaces was it was mostly when I'm talking about the women who returned back. So there was also the fear of not being able to live up to the societal standards of motherhood, for example. And this has also pulled these women to a position of guilt and blame. So there was a moment in my fieldwork where one of her son was just shouting at her for not being present at home when he wanted her the most, for example. So there was the guilt and blame which constantly played out within their everyday and it often raised rhetoric of the lack of undeservingness within the women. So to cope with the situation of blame, most women also practice transnational hypermaternalism, for example, how the women also try to kind of, probably sometimes give more dowry for their girl children who are getting married, or creating constructing a home back back in Kerala, for example, which is like a huge home with whatever they can afford, and it helped them cope with that absence as well. And that was how they were trying to kind of give their best back home. And migrating Gadamas sometimes forged the idea of parallel families also. It involves a very complex and unexpected emotional attachment at times. So Mariam was another woman who was very excited to talk about the kids she raised back in Kuwait. So she says, the kids I raised back in Kuwait are grown-ups now, and it feels so good when they call me. And when they call me, 2 girls and 2 boys whom she raised, and the elder one must be 35-year-old now, my son's age. I heard he's a reputed government employee now. He has kids now, and he tells me to come back and look after his kids. So I wish I could go back. So her eyes kind of gleamed when she said that. So the belongingness is the very idea of belongingness is very much intertwined with multiple factors, and there are ways in which these women have also tried to kind of cope with that sort of lack of belongingness that they have felt throughout in this migration as well, the migration process. So when I'm talking about the peripheries of migration regime, it forms a long continuum through which bureaucratic processes, like I said, the kafala system, and then there is the under 30 rule, they all also intersect their personal lives. And gender as an idea cannot be analyzed in isolation. Instead, gender is dynamic and it is articulated in different sites. And migrant women are often studied as heroines of development at times, and are assumed to be victims who are fragile. So rather than putting the women I worked with into these spectrums, I think it is important to take a step back and look at the women's interactional spaces. And it has been a challenging process, of course, especially in a system which does not have any sort of data around how many women, who are the women migrating, or any sort of channeling, for instance. There are no public agencies. Norca is one, but the non-resident Kerala, so organized. So they have been there, but also very limited. So for the high number of women moving from India, it has been very challenging to choose public recruitment system, which is more, which is not easy as well. But at the same time, we do not have enough public recruitment channels, for example. So that way, it has been very difficult to kind of trace the women at the same time. So I look at the system that facilitates the extraction of care here. So the system that enables it basically, and the spaces where precarity and uncertainty are constant. And definitely this movement is undoubtedly shaped by oppression and violence, but this also does not simply produce victimization or loss of agency within these women, but it also entails much more complex and varied negotiations with equally multiple outcomes. So like I said, these are the uprootings, and then there are the, the regroundings. So, but just in different forms throughout. So yes, thank you so much. That is pretty much it.
Thanks, Amal. Thank you so much for taking us through your very, very rich ethnography on being a Kadama. I just have one question, which is sort of, in this course we are looking at gender and transnationalism, but we're also looking at low-skilled migration, right? And how now we have all of these migration infrastructures for low-skilled migration. So I wanted to ask you if if your research participants were also aware of high-skilled migration in the same migration corridors from, Kerala to the Middle East. And if so, then what were their own views and ideas about these other migration, such as high-skilled migration, whereas, theirs is considered low-skilled migration in the official language and discourse. And also then, if you could then sort of share a little bit about your own thoughts on this migration, regime, which kind of, is so skill-oriented and class-oriented, right? And all of these are very recent developments in the context of contemporary neoliberal globalization. So if you could share with us your experience and thoughts on these issues.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that came to my mind when you talked about the high-skilled migrants coming from Kerala, for example, for them, these are employers for them. So it's the same Malayali employers which hire these women, right? So for these women, it's these men and women coming from a much upper class or upper caste, for example, doing the high skilled job back in the Gulf. So and also there are ways in which they have also navigated connections with them at the same time. So for example, the diasporic communities which lead these diasporic associations, be it the Sharjah Malayali Association or any sort of Malayali Indian associations back in the Gulf, they come from a certain class and they come from a certain background. They have other jobs to do as well. They are mostly the high skilled workers who are also a part of this. So there are ways in which they also form a sort of connection within them, because it was very important for them to kind of navigate through this, because there are times in which you could be deported at any time. You might need some sort of negotiation from your own community with the embassy back there. So even for that, there was action with the with the high skilled workers from Kerala. So that was one way in which I could see both ways sort of connected in that way.
So I would like to thank you very much for taking time out and doing this for us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
So there was a very interesting, a very enriching ethnographic study done by Dr. Amal Lateef that took us through various facets of our course actually. It sits in very well in the broad area of gender and transnationalism, right? And this also speaks to the whole feminization of migration, where you see this was a case study of female domestic workers moving from Kerala to the Middle East. And it also then, was told us a little bit about migration infrastructures, and specifically low-skill migration infrastructures. And so from various points of view, I think this was a very useful lecture. I hope you found it useful too. And most importantly, what I liked very much was the fact that she took us through her ethnography, and she also discussed the research process with you, which might be useful for some of you who are looking to do their own research projects. Thank you very much.